The briefing room smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, which was how Sergeant First Class John Drake knew it was just another Tuesday. He had his boots up on the edge of the folding table and a half-eaten protein bar balanced on his knee when the hollow projector flickered to life and painted the room blue. Around him, 14 soldiers in various states of alertness straightened up. Drake did not straighten up. He took a bite of the protein bar instead. "Sergeant Drake." The voice belonged to Colonel Fenwick, who was standing at the front of the room with the expression of a man who had been personally insulted by Drake's posture for the better part of 6 years. "If you could remove your boots from government property." "Colonel," Drake removed his boots. He set them on the floor with the precise care of a man who wanted everyone to know exactly how much effort that had cost him. The projector bloomed into a full tactical display, a star map Drake didn't recognize, populated with markers he'd never been briefed on. He sat up slightly, not because the colonel had asked, because the markers were red. "What you're looking at," Fenwick said, "is the Verath Reach, a contested transit corridor approximately 11 light hours from the Callaway Station perimeter." He tapped a control. The map zoomed. 3 days ago, a Verath patrol intercepted a convoy of our medical supply ships, 2 destroyed, 14 crew unaccounted for. "Unaccounted for," said Corporal Tesler from the back row, "meaning dead." "Meaning we don't know." "Meaning we need to know." Fenwick looked at Drake. "Meaning you and your team are going to find out." Drake studied the red markers. He had been in the service for 11 years. He had been on 6 contested deployments, 2 of which had gone sideways in ways that still visited him occasionally at 3 in the morning. He knew what unaccounted for usually meant. "What's the authorization level on this?" he asked. "Limited engagement. You go in as a survey unit. Civilian registration, no military transponder. If the Verath hail you, you're a mineral survey crew that got lost." "And if they don't believe us?" Fenwick said nothing. "Right," Drake said. He picked up the protein bar and finished it. "When do we leave?" He spent the next 2 hours studying the reach on the tactical system in the prep room, cross-referencing it against every piece of Verath territory data in the accessible files. The reach was a natural corridor, 2 dense asteroid fields creating a navigable lane about 40 million kilometers wide, which sounded like a lot until you understood that space wasn't empty, and that the Verath had been running patrols through it for at least 2 decades. It was, by any reasonable reading, their territory. The medical convoy had been running through it under a transit agreement that was, technically, still valid. Technically was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Drake made a note of the specific clauses of the transit agreement that covered medical supply convoys. He made a note of the specific articles in the non-interference charter that covered weapons testing on non-combatant personnel. He folded these notes and put them in the breast pocket of his jacket. He had spent enough of his career in situations where the right piece of paper, produced at the right moment, was the difference between a negotiation and something considerably louder. He also noted the phrase "unaccounted for" again, sitting with it for a moment. Unaccounted for was a diplomatic phrase. It was the phrase you used when you had an idea of what had happened and didn't want to say it in official documentation, because if you said it officially, you'd have to respond to it officially, and responding to it officially meant decisions that nobody wanted to make yet. He understood the decision. He wasn't sure he agreed with it, but he folded that thought up too and put it somewhere it wouldn't get in the way. His team assembled at 600 the next morning. 8 people, each of whom he had worked with before in contexts that ranged from complicated to genuinely catastrophic. Private Adara Solis, signals intelligence, compact and quiet with the alert eyes of someone who was always doing at least 3 things at once. Corporal Lee Tesler, recon and close assault, who had the unfortunate quality of looking younger than he was, which he'd learned to use as effectively as Drake used the opposite. Warrant Officer Eva Kim, pilot and navigation, who flew with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided early in her career that panic was a resource she couldn't afford. Corporal Wren, technical intelligence, who could read a data stream the way other people read a newspaper. Rodriguez and Okafor and Barris and Chen, each one recommended by people he trusted for reasons that ranged from combat effectiveness to the more ambiguous quality that he privately called getting it. The ability to read a situation and respond to what it actually was rather than what the initial read suggested. 8 people, 14 unaccounted for. He liked those odds less than he would have preferred, which was why he went back to the tactical system after dinner and stayed there until midnight. The ship was called the Morrow's Reach, which was either poetic or someone's idea of a joke. It was a converted freighter that had seen better decades, fitted with survey equipment that looked authentic enough to fool a casual scan and weapon systems that looked like nothing at all because they were hidden inside the fuel manifold housings, the LiDAR array housing, and in a modification that Drake had specifically requested, and that the quartermaster had looked at him strangely for the underside docking collar assembly. The ship looked, in every sense that mattered from the outside, like exactly what it claimed to be: a civilian survey vessel operated by a small crew that had been doing this long enough to stop caring about the aesthetics. Drake's team occupied the crew quarters with the practiced ease of people who had slept in worse. Solis had a system for her bunk that involved a series of small hooks she'd brought herself, from which she hung various equipment in precise order. Tesler slept immediately and completely, which was the ability of the truly experienced soldier. Kim stayed in the cockpit for the first 6 hours of transit, which was not required but which Drake understood. She was building her read on the ship, on how it responded, on the particular personality of the engine and the drift characteristics, and the idiosyncratic way the secondary thruster lag worked. Some pilots flew ships. Kim made friends with them. He was in the mess running through reconnaissance photos when Solis dropped into the seat across from him and slid a cup of coffee across the table. "You're doing the thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The staring at pictures like they'll talk to you thing." Drake picked up the coffee. It was too hot and slightly wrong in a way he couldn't name, which was the universal condition of all coffee brewed in space. They usually do, eventually. Solis pulled one of the photos toward her. It showed a section of the convoy wreckage that the long-range drone had managed to capture before losing signal, hull plating sheared off clean, not blasted, not burned. Sheared. Like something had simply reached out and removed it. "That's not weapon damage," she said. "No. I don't even know what that is." "Me neither," Drake took a sip, "but I'm going to." She looked at him for a moment with the expression junior soldiers sometimes got around him, not quite admiration, not quite confusion, somewhere in between. He knew what it meant. It meant she was trying to reconcile the man who had his feet on government furniture with whatever reputation had preceded him here. There was a reputation. He'd never asked about it in detail, which was a choice. The gap between what people expected based on reputation and what they found when they actually spent time with him was doing useful work, and he'd learned to let it run. She looked at the photo again. The sheer pattern is clean on all the edges, uniform depth. Whatever did this, it wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It's more like the material was told to separate. At a molecular level maybe, some kind of, I don't know, field weapon, resonance-based. Drake looked at her. "That's good thinking." "Based on nothing." "Based on what you're seeing, that's how you start." He took another sip of the wrong coffee. "Keep thinking." They crossed into the Reach on the 4th day without incident, which Drake didn't trust for a second. The Vereth were not known for letting things slide. They were a bipedal species, taller than humans by about half a meter on average, with bioluminescent patches along the jaw and collarbone that shifted color with mood and intent. Blue for calm, violet for aggression, a deep arterial red that the xenobiological files described as threat display, but which every soldier who'd actually faced one in the field called something less clinical and considerably more accurate. They communicated in layered harmonic frequencies that humans could hear but not produce, which made negotiation interesting and made their displeasure very, very audible. They had been spacefaring for approximately 300 years longer than humans, which they carried not as arrogance but as simple fact, the way you carry a height advantage, something that simply is, that doesn't need to be performed. They were also, every assessment agreed, organized, militarily precise, disciplined in a way that felt architectural, like every patrol was executing a plan several moves deep. Their fleet doctrine was considered among the most sophisticated in the explored sectors, which was why the assessment files used the word apex more than once, and why the diplomatic corps used phrases like carefully balanced relationship and mutually beneficial restraint and other constructions that translated roughly to, "We are in no position to push them and we know it." Drake had a theory about the word apex. It was a word people used when they wanted to make something sound impressive and permanent at the same time, like the thing it described was not just currently at the top, but had been there forever and would be there forever, and there was simply no arguing with it. He'd met a lot of apex things in his career. Most of them could be argued with. Given sufficient motivation and enough accurate information about exactly how the thing at the top got there, what it was willing to defend, and what it wasn't, where the edges of its certainty began to blur, given all of that, you could usually find a way to have a conversation. Drake was, by professional inclination, a very good conversationalist. The scan alert pinged at 1400 hours, ship time. Verath vessel, Warrant Officer Kim announced with the particular flatness of someone who had been trained to keep panic out of their voice and had practiced long enough that the flatness was now genuine. "Coming up fast on our port side. Military class, I'm reading a Keth pattern corvette. Fully armed, shields up." "Bring us down to survey speed," Drake said. "Transponder to civilian. Get the survey arrays spinning." "They're hailing us." "Answer." The comm opened. The sound that came through was immediately the sound of Verath communication, layered, resonant, felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. There was a subsonic element that did something interesting to the hindbrain, something that Drake suspected was entirely intentional on the part of Verath communication evolution, a frequency that lived just under the threshold of conscious hearing and registered in the body as something between warning and wait. Their universal translator box rendered the semantics into standard after a 2-second lag. "Unregistered vessel, you have entered restricted space. Identify or be seized." Drake leaned toward the comm. "This is the survey vessel Morrow's Reach, Callaway Station Registry, operating under Mineral Survey License 47 Gamma. We appear to have miscalculated our transit coordinates. Our tertiary navigation array has been giving us calibration errors for the past 48 hours. He put a very specific quality into the last sentence, mild, embarrassed, the tone of a professional who has been made to look foolish by his own equipment. "We apologize for the intrusion and are correcting our course now." Silence, then, "Stand by for boarding." Drake switched off the comm. "Tesla, get survey data on the screens. I want active scan readouts, mineral composition overlays, anything that looks like we've been running analysis. Make it look like we've been working for 6 days, not 4. He stood up. "Kim, maintain survey speed, don't deviate so much as a degree. Everyone else, we are mineral surveyors who got lost. I want confusion. I want mild embarrassment. I want the specific energy of people who are slightly relieved that someone official has shown up, because now maybe they can get some help with their navigation problem. I do not want combat readiness. Holster anything that looks like it wasn't purchased at a hardware outlet." He straightened his jacket. Civilian cut, slightly too large in the shoulders. He'd chosen it specifically for that quality, the way it made him look like someone who'd ordered clothes from a catalog and hadn't bothered to check the sizing. He looked in most assessments like nobody particularly. He had invested significant effort over the years in cultivating that look, and he felt, as he usually did before a boarding inspection, something that wasn't quite calm but was in the same neighborhood. The settled quality of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as possible and is now ready to work with whatever actually walks through the door. The boarding party was 3 Verath soldiers and one who wasn't a soldier. Drake knew she wasn't a soldier the moment she came through the airlock, not because of anything in her posture or her expression. Both were controlled and precise in the way that Verath high-register individuals tended to be, but because of the way the 3 soldiers arranged themselves around her, not flanking her as escorts would, not surrounding her as guards would. They were orienting toward her, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. She was the anchor point of the room the moment she entered it, and everything else, the soldiers, the space, the air itself, reorganized to acknowledge that. She was tall, even for a Verath. The bioluminescent patches along her jaw and collarbone burned a steady, composed blue, not the pale blue of mild interest, not the deep blue of active assessment, but the held blue of someone who has seen most things and is not anticipating being surprised by what they're about to see. She wore a uniform that wasn't quite military and wasn't quite civilian, something in between that Drake's reference files didn't have a category for. Command tier, maybe, the kind of rank that existed above the organizational chart rather than on it. She carried a data tablet in one hand and a scanner in the other, and she moved through the mess compartment of the Morrow's Reach with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been doing this long enough that the environment was simply a variable rather than an obstacle. She looked at Drake. The look lasted approximately half a second. The blue on her jaw flickered, briefly, to a lighter shade, something the xenobiological files called dismissive recognition, the Verath equivalent of a shrug, the register that indicated the thing you were looking at had been categorized and filed, and would not require further attention. He was nobody, she decided. He watched her decide. He was good at watching people make decisions about him because it was useful information, the kind that told you what room you had to work with later. Survey license, she said through the translator. Her harmonic frequency under the translated words was controlled, precise, the chilled steel voice of someone who had asked this question many times before and expected the answer in the same order it always arrived. Drake produced the license, fabricated excellent work. He'd used the same forger 3 times, and she'd never been wrong about which details customs and military officers actually checked, and which they scanned past. The officer, he was still working out what to call her, Princess, Commander, something high-tier and accustomed to being the authority in whatever room she entered, took the license and scanned it without looking at him again, her attention on the tablet as the data resolved. Your route deviates from the licensed corridor by 0.37 light hours, she said. Navigation error, Drake said. Our tertiary array calibration drifted. We ran a diagnostic 2 days ago and identified the problem, but the recalibration process takes time. We've been slowly correcting back to corridor. He produced the specific tone again. Mild embarrassment, professional frustration at the equipment rather than at being stopped. The voice of a man who knows he made an administrative mistake and is prepared to be cooperative about it. I can show you the diagnostic log if that would help. She looked at him again, a longer look this time. The blue held, but something in the shade shifted, barely perceptible, the visual equivalent of a second glance, a momentary recalibration that was over almost before it started. Whatever she'd found to trigger it, his posture, the particular cadence of his response, some quality in his eyes, she filed it and moved on. You will be escorted to the corridor boundary, she said. Any deviation will be interpreted as hostile intent and treated accordingly. Of course, we appreciate the assistance. She turned. Her soldiers fell in behind her with the precise coordination of individuals who had been doing this long enough that it required no thought. At the airlock she paused, one hand on the frame, body already through, and Drake saw her glance back at the compartment. At the screens showing survey data. At the crew in their civilian clothes doing their level best to look like mineral surveyors who had made a navigational mistake and were very sorry about it. At Drake in his too large jacket, hands in his pockets, watching her with the calm expression of a man who is waiting for something to be over. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. The blue held, she left. Drake waited until the airlock sealed, counted to 5 and sat down. He picked up his coffee. He took a long, slow sip. Sir Soley said quietly, "What was that?" That, Drake said, was someone who didn't look twice. He set the cup down. She will later. The escort lasted 4 hours before everything went wrong. The signal came from the direction of the nearest Varath relay station. A burst transmission on a military frequency that the Morrow's Reach's hidden intercept array caught, and their translation software chewed on for 90 seconds before producing a partial decode that Ren read off her screen with the careful pronunciation of someone who understood the words individually and was still working out what they meant collectively. 60% confidence, Ren said. The words I'm getting clearly are neural lattice, full deployment, test parameters, biological confirmation. She looked up. The timestamp suggests this was sent approximately 3 hours ago. Neural lattice, Kim said from the pilot's seat. That was flagged last year. The xenobiology team, they called it theoretical. Apparently it's less theoretical than advertised, Tesler said. Drake looked at the intercept data. Neural lattice. He turned the term over carefully. The xenobiological file on it had been sparse, more flag than file, the kind of entry that meant someone had confirmed something existed and nobody had confirmed what it did yet. Something related to the Varath's natural harmonic communication ability. Something that could be adapted, weaponized, applied externally to a biological nervous system that hadn't evolved to receive it. Something that would explain hull plating sheared off clean at the material bonding level. Not burned, not blasted, every molecular connection in the structure simultaneously told to let go. He thought about that for a moment. About what a signal that could do that to metal might do to living tissue, to a nervous system, to the neurons that translated thought into action. Ren, he said, can you trace the origin of the transmission, not the relay, the source? Already working on it. She worked for 40 seconds. Sir, the source isn't the relay station. It's something closer, inside the reach. There's a station. It's not on any chart I have access to. Drake looked at the star map. The reach, which had looked like a transit corridor, now looked like something else. A container. A space designed to look like a passage while actually being a room, and someone had locked the door. Kim, sensor sweep at maximum passive range. How long before the escort notices? At current separation, 3 minutes before their array reads our scan as active rather than navigational. Do it. The station was real, and it was large, significantly larger than any research installation had a reasonable justification for being, which told Drake that either the research was extremely ambitious or the word research was shouldering a load it hadn't been designed for. It occupied a gravitational null point between two minor bodies in the reach, positioned with the specific precision of something placed rather than found. Invisible on standard surveys. Not invisible to a military-grade passive array at close range. Biological signatures, Ren said, her voice doing the thing where the technical precision was doing the job of keeping the emotional response at a distance. Human biological signatures. I'm getting 14. 14, Drake said. Yes. He looked at Tesler. Tesler looked at him. 14 crew members from the convoy, unaccounted for. He pulled up the tactical display and looked at the geometry. The station's position, the escort's position, the corvette's current trajectory, the Morrow's reach's location and heading. He ran through it the way he ran through everything, not building a plan immediately but mapping the constraints first, understanding what was fixed and what was fluid, where the decision points were, and what opened up at each one. The colonel's briefing. Limited engagement, civilian registration. If the Varath hail you, you're a mineral survey crew. 14 people in a station that wasn't on any chart. He thought about the hull plating, sheared off clean. Okay, he said, quietly without inflection, the way you'd announce you were going for a walk. Here's what we're going to do. The plan was not elegant. Drake's plans were rarely elegant. Elegance implied optimization for appearance, and appearances were the thing you worried about after the situation was resolved. His plans were thorough and they were adaptive, built with explicit consideration for the points at which they were most likely to fail, and what the response to failure at each point would be. The escort corvette's positioning was a constraint he could use. Running close on their port side, its sensor arrays were oriented to track them, which meant the direction of the station was in the shadow of its own scan coverage. A calculated engine fault at the right moment would produce a plausible deviation without registering as evasion. The window before the corvette could reposition, approximately 9 minutes, possibly 8 if he was being conservative, which he usually was. 9 minutes, Solly said when he laid it out. 8 if we're careful. To cross that distance and board a station we know nothing about. We know a few things about it. We know it's big, it has an unlisted energy signature, and it has 14 of our people in it somewhere. That's a meaningful amount of information to work with. He looked around the table. Tesler, Kim, Solis, Wren, Rodriguez, Akafer, Barris, Chen, 8 faces in the low blue light of the mess, each one holding the same calculation behind their eyes. He'd worked with all of them long enough to read the calculation. None of them were afraid exactly. They were measuring, which was a different thing. We don't know the internal layout, Akafer said. Entry point choke points where they're holding the crew. We'll know more once we're inside. The station's power signature suggests a standard Varath deep space configuration. We have reference schematics for that type. It's a starting framework, not a map. And the neural lattice, Wren asked. Drake looked at her. We don't have a read on it yet, we work around that. If it can do what the ship wreckage suggests. We work around it, he said again, not dismissively, firmly. There was a specific quality he needed the room to hold right now, and that quality required him to be certain not because the situation warranted certainty, but because certainty was what allowed people to move. You could adjust to reality once you were in motion. You couldn't adjust if you were still standing in the mess running threat assessments. Rodriguez and Barris, you're with Kim on the ship, keep her running, keep her ready, we need a clean exit window. Chen, you're on comms. Everyone else, 2 teams once we're aboard. Tesler, you take Wren and Akafer. Find the holding area, that's your only job. I take Solis. We find the weapon system and whoever's operating it. He looked around the table one more time. We have 8 minutes from breach, he said. Let's not need all of them. The inside of the station smelled like ozone, and something organic that Drake couldn't classify, sharp and slightly sweet, like fruit that had been sealed in a container past its ideal state. The corridors were Varath dimensioned, tall, subtly too wide for human proportions, the floors textured in a pattern that his boots kept trying to read as uneven ground. The lighting was bioluminescent, the Varath's equivalent of fluorescent, and it cast everything in a faint blue-violet that made the shadows look deeper than they were, and the edges of things slightly indistinct. They moved fast and quiet, which was Solis' natural register and Drake's professional one. The station sounds were wrong in a way he kept cataloging without consciously deciding to, too quiet in some sections, too active in others, irregular in a way that suggested not routine operation but something in a specific phase, something underway. something that had a before and an after, and they were in the middle of it. The first locked door was bolted from the outside. Not locked, bolted. A physical crossbar, the kind of thing you used when you needed to guarantee that whatever was on the other side of the door could not open it regardless of what any electronic system said. The kind of thing you used when you didn't trust the thing on the other side to be predictable. Solis had the bar off in 40 seconds. Behind the door was a human soldier. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall and his knees drawn up to his chest, and he was a large man, combat frame, clearly military, the kind of person who was not typically found sitting on floors, and he was absolutely still in the way that you are absolutely still when the stillness is itself an act of will. Not resting, holding. His eyes tracked to Drake the moment the door opened, and what was in them was not relief. It was warning. "Don't," he said. His voice was hoarse and very controlled, the voice of someone who has been using control as currency for a long time and is running low. "Don't come closer." Drake stopped in the doorway. He stayed there. "Sergeant Drake, 3rd Recon. We're here to get you out." "I know what you are." The soldier's jaw tightened. "I can hear your heartbeat, both of you. It's the device does that, makes me hear things that aren't. They put something on me. A lattice, they called it. It's in my head and it's been building and it wants me to." He stopped. "It wants me to attack anyone who comes close. Pressure release. That's the design, I think. I think I've figured out the design." Drake looked at the man's hands, pressed flat against the floor, deliberate. "How long?" Drake asked. 18 hours approximately. The soldier looked at him steadily. "I've been fighting it for 18 hours. What's your name?" "Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, 44th Forward Recon." "Webb, I need you to hold on for about 20 more minutes. We're going to find the device and shut it off. Can you do that?" Webb looked at him. Bloodshot eyes, exhausted beyond most people's understanding of that word, and absolutely steady. 20 minutes. Give or take. A pause. "I've been doing it for 18 hours. 20 minutes is nothing." He pressed his hands harder against the floor, a physical anchor, Drake understood, something real to push against when the signal pushed back. "Go." Drake nodded. They moved on. The weapon control center was deeper in the station, and they found it by sound. The neural lattice, when operational, produced a frequency that was Verath in origin, harmonic, layered, felt in the chest before it registered with the ears. Drake had been aware of something at the edge of perception since they docked, a presence he'd been filing as station machinery. He reclassified it now and moved toward it, and the quality of it changed as they got closer, became more directional, more specific, like tuning into a signal that had been broadcasting all along, and you'd been too far from the source to resolve it clearly. The control room door was not locked, it was guarded. 2 Verath soldiers outside the door, which was a manageable problem. One Verath in non-military dress visible through the door's observation panel, standing at a control console with his back to them, which was a scientist, which was a different and more complicated problem than soldiers. Drake took the guards in 6 seconds, which was not a record but was efficient. The sounds he made were not dramatic. This was something he'd worked on specifically, the ability to accomplish significant physical things without the sounds that usually accompanied them, because sounds created information and information created response, and he preferred to control both for as long as possible. The scientist heard the impact of the second guard and turned, and Drake was across the room with his forearm across the man's collarbone before he'd completed the turn. "The lattice," Drake said. "How do you shut it down?" The Verath scientist looked at him. His bioluminescent patches went violet, deep violet, aggressive, the registers that preceded action. "You are one soldier," the translator rendered his words in a tone of structured contempt, the contempt of a specialist for a layperson who has wandered into a domain they don't understand. "You have no authority here. You have no leverage here. Release me and—" "Your guards are down," Drake said. The lattice off switch. There is no off switch. And here the contempt shifted into something else, something the translator flattened into neutrality but which Drake heard underneath as satisfaction, as the specific pleasure of someone who is about to explain why the intruder has fundamentally misunderstood the situation. The lattice is not a device you deactivate. It is a frequency. Once it integrates with a biological nervous system, the signal itself becomes secondary. The system has already begun to restructure. Cessation of broadcast changes nothing about the host's internal state. Drake kept his arm in place. He kept his expression where it was, so the host system self-destructs. The host system reaches a threshold state and yes, the violet deepened. It is not a flaw, it is a feature. The subject becomes a weapon until the weapon is expended. We designed it to prevent capture and extraction of compromised personnel. He paused, and the pause had a shape to it, the shape of something being weighed and then offered because offering it cost nothing. Your people have been resistant, unusually so. One subject has maintained coherence for 18 of your hours. The calculations suggested 6 at most. We have been taking extensive readings. The data has been quite instructive. Drake was quiet for a moment. Is there, he said, a way to remove the lattice that doesn't kill the host? The violet flickered. I just finished explaining that. I heard what you explained. I'm asking if there's a way. Theoretical, experimental, something you haven't tried. Counter-frequency, signal disruption, anything that interferes with the integration process. The scientist looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, a specific kind of recalibration. The moment when contempt meets something it doesn't have a category for and has to pause. He was looking at Drake the way you look at something you had assessed and filed, and have just discovered the file was incomplete. In theory, he said slowly, with the caution of a scientist who does not want to commit to something that might be wrong. A counter-frequency at the precise inverse of the lattice's integration signature, delivered directly to the affected system, could disrupt the structural integration before it fully anchors. The calibration required would be extremely precise. The margin for error. Show me the console. You don't have the technical background. Show me the console. We'll discuss technical background while we work. The calibration took 11 minutes, which was 8 minutes longer than they had, which meant they ran 4 minutes over the window they'd built for the escort to reposition, which meant when they finally broadcast the counter-frequency, it was with the knowledge that the Corvette was already repositioning and the clock on clean extraction had expired. Drake didn't mention this to the scientist. He kept the conversation technical, methodical, moving through the calculations with Wren's voice in his ear, and Solis' signals intelligence background filling the gaps that the scientist's explanations left open. The scientist, his translator, gave his name as something that resolved phonetically as Kelthaven, discovered somewhere around the 4th minute that Drake was not going to stop asking questions until he understood the answers, and that the questions were specific and accurate, and that the figure holding him braced against his own console with calm, unhurried force was not what he had initially categorized him as. What he had initially categorized him as was a soldier, large biological unit, moderate intelligence, accustomed to following commands in structured environments, the kind of organism you locked in a room and waited for the lattice to handle. What he was finding was something different. The inverse carrier wave needs to be anchored at the frequency's baseline, Wren said through Drake's earpiece. Not the broadcast frequency, the base, the frequency everything else is built on. Kelthaven, Drake said, baseline frequency, not broadcast, show me. Kelthaven showed him. They got the calibration right on the 2nd attempt. Drake broadcast the counter-frequency on the station-wide array. 14 biological signatures on the station's internal scanner, 14 individuals who had been in the grip of a signal designed to hollow them out and expend them like ammunition. The signatures flickered. One by one, They changed from the sharp, irregular pattern of lattice integration to something steadier, something that resolved, as Drake watched, into the rhythms of 14 people coming back to themselves. His comms crackled. "Tesla, sir, something just happened. The crew, I think they're coming back. Whatever was on them just, I don't know how to describe it, like a signal dropped." "Head count," Drake said. A pause. 14, sir, all 14. Drake let out a breath. It was a quiet breath, not dramatic, the breath of someone who had been holding something and has just set it down. "Get them to the ship. Move." He looked at Kelthaven. "You're coming with us." The violet on Kelthaven's jaw cycled to something very dark. "I will not." "You designed a weapon that restructures human nervous systems," Drake said. "You have data on it. That data is going to be useful to the people who figure out how to make sure it never works again." He picked up Kelthaven's data tablet from the console. "Also, I'm taking this." They made the ship in 4 minutes. The Corvette had repositioned. This was confirmed by the hail that came through on every available frequency, the moment the Morrow's reach cleared the station dock. Verath harmonics cycling through registers the translator rendered as halt and stand down, an unregistered vessel. The subsonic element that lived under the words pressing against the chest like a hand. Drake pushed the thrust to maximum and opened a channel. "This is Sergeant First Class John Drake, 3rd Recon, Terran Defense Force. I have 14 personnel from the Callaway Medical Convoy on board, individuals who were seized from a civilian transport in violation of Article 7 of the Verath Terran Non-Interference Charter, and subjected to illegal weapons testing." He kept his voice level, the voice he used for conversations where he needed the other party to understand that the emotional register of what he was saying was not anger and was not fear, but was something considerably more difficult to argue with: certainty. "I also have your chief weapons researcher on board and approximately 9 terabytes of classified project data." He paused. "You can fire on us. You should also be aware that we have already transmitted a summary of this data, including the station's location and the nature of the weapons program, to Callaway Station. That transmission went out 14 minutes ago. It will arrive whether or not we do." He paused again. "I'd suggest that option 2, letting us leave, gives your command structure the opportunity to address what happened here before anyone else does. Option 1 forecloses that opportunity permanently." He paused a third time. "The choice is yours. I want to be clear that I understand it's yours." Silence. Kim had her hands on the controls. Solis had her eyes on the weapons readout. Drake could hear, in the quality of the silence on the bridge, 14 people who were not breathing. The weapons lock held for 11 seconds. He counted them. They were the specific kind of seconds that were longer than normal seconds, the kind that had weight, the kind where you became very aware of the distance between where you were and where you needed to be. Then the lock dropped. The Corvette began to fall back. Drake reached for the coffee that someone had brought to the bridge at some point, cold now, wrong in the way space coffee was always wrong, and took a long, deliberate sip. He tasted it. He took his time about it. "Sir," Kim said, her flatness now carrying a very specific quality, the flatness of someone who is processing something they hadn't fully expected. "Are we through?" "We're through," Drake said. She turned back to her controls. She set a course for Callaway Station, and the Morrow's reach moved through the reach toward the corridor boundary, and the Corvette did not follow. 4 hours later, in the small equipment bay off the bridge, Drake received a signal on a private channel keyed to his personal identifier. The face on the screen was Verath, high-tier female, the same officer who had boarded the Morrow's reach and decided he was nobody. The bioluminescent patches on her jaw burned deep indigo, a shade the files put somewhere between calibration and reassessment, a color that didn't exist in the standard emotional register chart because it was, the files noted, rarely observed. She looked at him for a long moment. "Sergeant Drake," she said. "Commander," Drake said. He decided on Commander. "It fit. I made an assessment when I boarded your vessel," she said. "I was incorrect." Drake looked at her. He thought about what it cost someone to say that, in a species whose entire command structure was built on the premise that a Verath judgment once made was not revisited. The assessment was the thing. The assessment was the architecture. Coming back to correct it was not something the system made easy. She'd done it anyway. "You had reasonable grounds for the assessment you made," he said. "I had," she said, "exactly the information I chose to pay attention to." The Indigo held. The weapon program operating in the Reach was not authorized by formal command. "I am informing the relevant structures. You will have formal confirmation of your personnel's safe return status through diplomatic channels within the standard period." "I appreciate that." She looked at him for another moment. When she spoke again, the translator gave her the same chilled steel voice, but something in the harmonic register under the words was different, lower, more deliberate, something the files didn't have a clean category for. "There are those in our command structure who have studied your species at length," she said. "The assessment files describe humans as unpredictable." "I've heard that. It is not used as a compliment in the literature." "I know. The weapon program was designed to address that particular variable, to make human subjects responsive, controllable, to introduce predictability at the neurological level." She paused. "Your subject maintained resistance to the lattice for 18 of your hours. The design calculations did not account for that duration. I am told it is not an isolated incident in the data." Drake thought about Webb on the floor, hands pressed flat. 20 minutes is nothing. He thought about what 18 hours of that looked like from the inside. He didn't have words for it, not because the words didn't exist, but because the thing itself didn't fit inside language very cleanly. It fit inside the body more naturally, in the hands pressed down, in the jaw held tight, in the decision made and made again every second for 18 hours. "It's not a strategy," he said. "It's not training exactly. It's when someone tells us to stop, we keep going. When the calculation says we're done, we keep going anyway. I can't explain it better than that." She was quiet, the Indigo held. "That is what makes you unpredictable," she said. "I know," Drake said. "It bothers everyone." Something happened in her face, something small and fast, a movement that was over almost before it registered. He'd spent 11 years reading faces across species lines, and what he thought he saw, just for a moment, in the composed expression of a Verath command tier officer who had been built for certainty, was the specific look of someone who had heard something they were going to have to sit with for a while. Not a threat, not information they could file and act on. Something that required different processing. He was okay with that. That was exactly the right kind of thing to leave someone with. The channel closed. The debrief at Callaway Station took 3 days and 11 separate interviews, which was a new personal record for Drake, and not one he was particularly proud of. Webb was in the medical section for 2 days before the lattice effects cleared fully, which the physician said was faster than the projection based on Kelthaven's data. When Drake stopped in on the second day, Webb was sitting up in the cot reading a physical book, which Drake found both anachronistic and completely appropriate. 20 minutes was nothing, Drake said. Webb looked up. Turned out it was 12, he said. Tesler told me. He went back to the book. I wanted on record that I had 6 minutes to spare. It'll be in the report. Good. On the second day of the debrief, a general asked him about the weapon's lock that had held for 11 seconds before dropping. The general had the expression of someone running a calculation they weren't sure they were reading correctly. You had no real leverage, the general said. The researcher wasn't valuable enough to them to stop them firing. They could have destroyed your vessel and recovered data separately. Probably. So why didn't they fire? Drake thought about deep indigo, and I was incorrect, and the small, fast thing that had moved across her face. He thought about the look, which he recognized because he'd seen versions of it before, not often, not in most opponents, but occasionally in the ones who were actually good. The ones who were good enough to know when they'd missed something. Because she needed time, he said. She'd made an assessment, she'd filed it. When the situation turned out to be different from the assessment, she needed a moment to update her model. He paused. We caught her in that moment. We survived, the general said slowly, because she was reconsidering her assumptions. We survived, Drake said, because she was good enough to admit she'd been wrong. Most people can't do that in 11 seconds. Most people, most species, from what I've seen, can't do it at all. The certainty is structural. It holds even when it shouldn't. He picked up his coffee, right temperature this time. He was in a room where someone had made coffee correctly. He took a moment to appreciate this. She could, that's worth knowing. The general stared at him. You're telling me we should be less concerned about an opponent who can reconsider her own mistakes. I'm telling you that an opponent who can do that is a different kind of problem than one who can't. More complicated, also potentially more useful. He drank the coffee. Worth paying attention to. The formal diplomatic fallout took 8 months and produced 3 separate agreements, 2 of which Drake never read in full, because the language they used was designed to accomplish things without naming them, which was a skill Drake respected in diplomacy and found exhausting as reading material. What he knew: the station in the Reach was dismantled. The neural lattice program was officially closed. Kelthaven's data went to a biomedical team who worked with it for 2 years and produced countermeasure protocols that were subsequently added to standard field medical equipment. Webb went back to his unit, received a decoration he later described as the kind of thing you put in a drawer, and was reported by his commanding officer to be the same as before, which his commanding officer meant as an observation and Webb took as a compliment. Drake went back to his unit. He went back to recycled air and burnt coffee and briefing rooms. He was promoted twice in the following year, both times over his stated preference, and both times in ways that didn't significantly change what he did or where he was, which were the only promotions he was willing to accept. 3 months after the Reach, a message arrived through a channel he'd never used before, a channel that had been created specifically for this transmission and was evidently going to be closed after, because when he tried to reply through it 2 days later, it was gone. The message was text only, no identifier. The syntax of it, the way it built toward its point with careful, incremental precision, was not the syntax of standard as spoken by anyone whose first language was standard. It read, "The records of the Reach incident have been reviewed at the level at which records are reviewed. The program responsible has been identified as operating without formal sanction. The individuals responsible are no longer in their positions. This is the formal record." A break, then, what you said about how your people are built. I have been thinking about it since the conversation. We spend considerable resources calculating what an opponent can do. We spend very little effort considering what an opponent will refuse to stop doing regardless of the calculation. This is a category error. I believe the category error is widespread enough to have affected our assessments significantly. And then below that, I will not make that error again. Drake read it twice. He sat with it the way you sit with something that is both simple and significant, one of those things that fits in one hand but weighs more than it looks like it should. Then he found a piece of actual physical paper. Solis had mocked him for keeping a pad of it, had mocked him for the pen he used to write on it, had mocked him with the specific affection of someone who found the habit inexplicable and endearing, and wrote a reply. 5 words, in his own handwriting, which was not elegant but was legible. He sent it through the same channel. The 5 words were, Good, that's how it starts. He never received a reply, which was fine. The absence of a reply from someone who had just demonstrated the capacity to revise their own certainties was its own kind of message. It meant received, filed, integrated. He put the paper down. He picked up his coffee, which was too hot and slightly wrong in the way that space coffee always was. Outside the narrow porthole of his quarters, the stars held their positions with the absolute certainty of things that had been there far longer than any assessment of them. He looked at them. He thought about Apex, and what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and the 11 seconds between a weapons lock and a weapons lock dropping. He thought about 20 minutes being nothing. He drank the coffee, wrong temperature and all, and went back to work. Tesla found him 2 weeks after Callaway, in the prep room at 2300 hours, which was where Drake went when he couldn't sleep and didn't want to pretend he could. "You're doing the pictures thing," Tesla said. "I'm doing the pictures thing," Drake agreed. Tesla sat down across from him. He was quiet for a moment, a quality Drake appreciated in him, the willingness to be present without filling the space. Most people couldn't do that. They felt the silence and moved to cover it. Tesla let silences be what they were. On the table in front of Drake was not reconnaissance photography this time. It was a printout, something the comms technician had run off for him of the xenobiological assessment files on the Verath. Not the recent ones, the original ones. The ones written by the first contact teams 2 decades ago, when everything was new information and nobody had any framework yet, and the people writing the assessments were trying to describe, in technical language, things that didn't have technical language yet. The first contact teams had struggled with the concept of the Verath's apex designation, not because they doubted it, the evidence was clear, but because there was something in the way the Verath carried it that the technical language wasn't built to hold. The teams had tried words like certain and assured and settled, and none of them had been exactly right. The quality they were reaching for was something more specific. The Verath's certainty wasn't arrogance. It was an assumption. It was something that had been built incrementally over centuries, tested against reality repeatedly, and found reliable. It wasn't that they assumed they were at the apex. It was that they had checked multiple times, and the check had come back the same way every time. That, Drake thought, was the thing that made what had happened interesting. She hadn't just revised an assessment. She had revised an assessment that belonged to a system that didn't expect to need revising. The entire architecture of Verath's certainty, centuries of testing, centuries of the check coming back the same, had produced in her, and in the command structure she represented, a confidence that was not arrogant but was, in a very specific way, inflexible. The confidence of something that has been right so many times that rightness has stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a property. And then she had looked at him in his too large jacket with his wrong coffee, and she had said, "I was incorrect," and she had meant it, and she had done something about it. Drake found that, and he turned this word over several times, checking it, remarkable. Not in the sense of impressive, though it was that. In the older sense, the sense of a thing that deserved to be remarked on, that changed the shape of the room it was in. "You're thinking about her," Tesla said. Drake looked at him. "I'm thinking about the encounter." "Sure," a pause. "Webb asked me to tell you something." "Yeah," he said, and I'm quoting exactly. He was specific about the quote, he said. "Tell Drake that the 20 minutes was the easy part. The hard part was the first hour, when I thought nobody was coming." Drake was quiet for a moment. "What happened in the first hour?" "He made a decision," Tesla said. "He said he decided that it didn't matter whether anybody came or not. He was going to hold on anyway, just because he decided to, and he wasn't going to stop having decided that just because the math got worse." Drake looked at the assessment files. He looked at the word apex, which was there in the original documentation. in the careful tentative language of the first contact teams who were trying to describe something they'd never seen before. "That's it," he said. "What's it?" "That's the part they couldn't calculate." He tapped the file. "They ran every analysis. Strength, endurance, tactical capability, biological resilience. They modeled everything they could measure." He paused. "You can't measure the hour when nobody's coming and you decide it doesn't matter." Tesler was quiet. "That's the variable," Drake said. "The one that doesn't fit the model." Outside the porthole of the prep room, a narrow rectangle of transparency, the stars held their positions. Drake looked at them for a moment, and then he looked back at the files, and then he picked up his coffee and drank it and got back to work, because there was always work, and the work was always the thing you came back to when the thinking was done. The message from Webb came 6 months later, through standard channels, forwarded from the 44th home station, with a routing note that suggested it had taken a while to find him. It was 2 lines: "Got promoted. They gave me a commendation and I told them the commendation was yours. They said that's not how commendations work. Figured you'd appreciate that." Drake read it. He wrote back 2 words: "Sounds right." He thought about sending more. He thought about the quality of Webb's eyes in that room, bloodshot and steady, and what it had taken to be both of those things at the same time. He thought about the word nothing and the way Webb had used it, not dismissively, not with bravado, but with the specific precision of someone who had looked at something clearly and called it exactly what it was. 20 minutes was, in fact, nothing. Set against 18 hours, against the first hour when nobody was coming, against the decision that was made once and then made again every second. 20 minutes was genuinely nothing. Drake found, unexpectedly, that he was proud of Webb in a way that was hard to describe and pointless to try. Not proud the way you were proud of a subordinate who performed well. Something more like the specific, quiet pride of someone who had been present when another person showed the rest of the universe something it hadn't fully accounted for. He sent the 2 words, and then he went back to the prep room, and the recycled air, and the coffee that was always wrong, and the stars outside the porthole that were always exactly where they'd always been. He thought, this is the part they can't model. He thought, good. He picked up the coffee and he drank it. And somewhere in the Verath reach, in the reorganized command structure that had quietly dismantled a weapons program and reassigned its architects, a deep indigo assessment had been filed and logged and integrated into something larger than a single encounter, into the accumulated record of what humanity was, and wasn't, and might unexpectedly prove to be. The record that noted, in Verath technical language that didn't have a clean category for the thing it was describing, unpredictable. And below that, in the careful notations of someone who had decided to look twice, unpredictable not because they are random, unpredictable because the variable that governs their behavior is a decision, made internally, revised by nothing external, that cannot be accessed from outside the system. That notation would be referenced over the following years by analysts and commanders and diplomats who were trying to build models that accounted for humans. Most of them found it unsatisfying because it wasn't really a model at all. It was an acknowledgement that the model had a limit. Drake never saw the notation. He would have recognized it anyway. He'd been living inside it for 11 years.